One case in Washington, D.C., when a suburban mother vanished without a trace in the middle of the night. Brian Wilson and his wife, Ingga, had gone out together on a Friday evening. The last time he saw her was around 11:30 p.m. that night. When she failed to return home, concern quickly turned into alarm. With no witnesses and few leads, investigators faced an uphill battle. It was the early morning hours of the 13th of December, 2003, at about 3:30 a.m. in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, a quiet suburb less than 30 minutes from the FBI's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Dispatchers received a 911 call from a man reporting his wife missing. "Can I help you?" the operator asked. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied. "My wife went out around 11:30 to run to the store on the corner, and she still hasn't come back." When officers arrived at the home, they found 6-year-old Brian Wilson, visibly shaken. He explained that he and his wife had spent the evening together. Earlier that night, on December 12, the couple had enjoyed a date, dinner, and a movie after Ingga dropped their 2 young sons off at her aunt's house. Once back home, Ingga mentioned she wanted to step out for a few minutes to pick up some candy from a nearby store. That simple errand would be the last time Brian saw her. He later fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up hours later and realize she was still gone. He tried calling her cell phone several times, leaving a worried message. "Sweetheart, where are you? You should have been back by now. Please call me when you get this." Ingga Wilson, just 31 years old, was a devoted mother to 2 young boys, ages 9 and 3. Her sudden disappearance would soon set off an intense investigation, one that tested the skill and persistence of the FBI's finest agents. There was simply no reason for Ingga to vanish into the night. The thought was unthinkable. Overcome with panic, Brian quickly sprang into action. He dressed, grabbed his car keys, and set out to find his wife. The nearest gas station was only a few minutes from their home, a Shell station with a small convenience store located at the entrance of their community. It was the most logical place for Ingga to have gone for the candy she mentioned before leaving. When Brian arrived, however, the clerk told him that no one matching her description had been there that evening. Growing more desperate, Brian began circling the neighborhood, driving up and down familiar streets in search of any trace of her. He called her cell phone repeatedly, hoping she might pick up or perhaps had returned home while he was out looking. Each time he found nothing, he retraced the same route, looping between their house and the nearby roads, but there was no sign of Ingga anywhere. With fear tightening around him, Brian decided to reach out to her family. "I'm looking for Ingga," he said anxiously over the phone. Her aunt, Helen Furlow, one of Ingga's closest relatives, answered. "Ingga is one of my favorite nieces," Helen later recalled. "She's outgoing, full of life, the kind of person everyone enjoys being around." Helen was stunned to get such a call in the middle of the night. "It was around 2 in the morning when Brian called," she said. "He asked if I'd seen Ingga," I said. "No, I haven't heard from her. He told me she hadn't come home, and I just remember saying, 'Oh my God.'" Neither Helen nor any other family member had spoken to Ingga that night. As the minutes turned to hours, their worry deepened. Brian, now frantic, contacted his own relatives for help and then called the police to officially report his wife missing. "Who's your wife?" the dispatcher asked. "Ingga Wilson," Brian replied. "Ingga. She's black." "How old is she?" "She's 31. When the first responding officer arrived at the Wilson home, Brian's mother was already there, sitting with him as they anxiously waited for news. While police began their search, a bulletin was issued for both Ingga Wilson and her missing vehicle. For the moment, all Brian could do was wait and hope. Less than 12 hours later, a grim discovery was made more than 15 miles away in northeast Washington, D.C. A man walking down Adams Street noticed a vehicle parked oddly along the curb. Something about it caught his attention. There appeared to be someone inside. As he approached, he quickly realized the person wasn't asleep. The woman in the car was motionless, and she appeared to have suffered gunshot wounds to the head. Horrified, he immediately called 911. D.C. Emergency 911. What's your emergency? Yes, ma'am, the caller said. There's a car here with a body inside. Police and emergency responders rushed to the 3000 block of Adams Street. There, they found a green SUV parked quietly by the roadside. Inside, in the front passenger seat, was the lifeless body of a woman. At first, detectives had little information to work with. The vehicle wasn't running, the doors were closed, and there were no immediate clues pointing to who she was or how she had ended up there. Once they traced the vehicle's registration and confirmed her identity, the realization struck the victim was 1-year-old Ingga Wilson, reported missing the night before. Ingga was found seatbelted in the passenger seat. Blood had pooled beneath her and along the armrest beside her. Her glasses had been knocked from her face, with the frames later found tucked inside the passenger side map pocket. She had been shot 4 times in the head. The discovery sent shockwaves through everyone who knew her. The news reached her family and left them shattered. A night that began with a simple trip to the store had ended in unimaginable tragedy. Because the murder occurred within the Washington, D.C. city limits, local police were able to enlist the help of one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world, the FBI. Among those called in to consult on the case was Brad Garrett, one of the FBI's most respected and experienced agents. Known within the Bureau as Dr. Death for his remarkable record of solving complex homicide cases, Garrett brought both academic expertise and field experience to the investigation. I have a PhD in criminology, he explained. I was also a profiler. Most of the cases I worked on didn't come to me unless others were stuck. Garrett was immediately struck by the brutality and precision of the crime. She was shot at close range, he observed. It appears the shots came from the driver's side toward the passenger seat where she was found. The killer clearly wanted her to die in that car. The crime scene itself provided numerous clues. Investigators recovered 2 shell casings from the back seat area and determined that Ingga had been shot at the location where the vehicle was found, not moved afterward. The shattered window supported this conclusion. If the car had been driven after the shooting, Garrett explained, the glass would have completely fallen out. Despite the violent nature of the attack, the scene appeared strangely calm. Ingga's body was seatbelted, her clothing undisturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle. To Garrett, this suggested that she likely knew her killer, someone she trusted enough to be sitting in the car beside. A quick examination around the vehicle turned up another curious discovery. Several small, empty Ziploc bags commonly used to package street-level quantities of drugs, such as crack cocaine. Investigators began to question whether Ingga might have been in the area for a reason other than buying candy. Yet, one crucial detail deepened the mystery. No weapon was found at the scene. Whoever committed the murder had taken the weapon with them, leaving behind only questions and a trail that was growing colder by the minute. Investigators soon determined that a .380 caliber handgun had been used in the murder. The shell casings recovered at the scene confirmed the weapon type, but they also revealed something unsettling. The killer hadn't just taken a life. They had taken key evidence with them. There were no car keys left in the ignition. Whoever committed the crime had deliberately taken them before leaving. Ingga's cell phone was also missing, suggesting that the killer had removed anything that could connect them to the scene. When authorities notified Ingga's family of her death, the devastating news rippled through everyone who knew her. "Oh my God," her aunt recalled. "The whole family started calling each other. We couldn't believe it. The loss was especially painful for Ingga's 2 young sons. Her youngest was too little to fully grasp what had happened. He only understood that his mother had gone to heaven. For Brian Wilson, the nightmare deepened when he was asked to formally identify his wife's body. Detectives met with him, and through tears and disbelief, he confirmed that the victim was indeed his wife, Ingga. Family members gathered around to support him, bringing food, comfort, and company as they all tried to process the unbearable reality. Meanwhile, detectives canvassed the area where Ingga's body was found, hoping to find witnesses or surveillance footage that might shed light on what happened. No one had seen or heard anything unusual that night. The case presented enormous challenges. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no clear forensic evidence to point toward a suspect. The FBI's task force knew they were dealing with a meticulous killer. When you don't have witnesses or solid physical evidence, it becomes an uphill battle, one investigator noted. The most pressing question quickly became clear. Who was driving the car that night? Who had taken the keys in Ingga's life? By December 2003, just 12 hours after she was first reported missing, 1-year-old Ingga Wilson, a beloved mother of 2 and a hard-working professional, had been found shot to death inside her green SUV in northeast Washington, D.C. She had been shot multiple times on the left side of her head, suggesting she never saw the weapon when it was fired. The brutality of the act spoke of anger, possibly even rage, but it was also calculated. Whoever pulled the trigger had made sure she would not survive. Friends and family were left stunned. Ingga was known as a devoted mother and a steady worker, trying to build a better life for her family. By all outward appearances, she and her husband seemed to be the perfect couple. No one could understand who would want to harm her or why. "Oh my God," one relative recalled. "Go to church. Everyone was talking about them." The community buzzed with disbelief and sorrow as investigators continued to focus on Ingga's husband, Brian Wilson. During questioning, Brian shared a curious and intimate detail about their final evening together, a detail that caught the investigators' attention. He explained that after they had been intimate that night, Ingga mentioned wanting something sweet. She had a habit of eating candy afterward, he said, but their cupboards were empty. According to Brian, that was why she decided to go out late to pick up candy from the convenience store just around the corner. It was supposed to be a quick trip. Ingga never made it back. To detectives, this story raised more questions than it answered. Was this really just a tragic coincidence, or was something else at play? The theory that it had been a random attack seemed unlikely. Ingga still had her jewelry on, which didn't fit the pattern of a robbery. A carjacking also didn't make sense. The killer had taken her keys but left the car behind. Why would someone take the keys but not the vehicle? One investigator wondered aloud. The recovered 380 shell casings confirmed the weapon used, and the small drug baggie found behind her SUV added another unsettling layer. Could Ingga have been meeting someone to buy drugs rather than candy? Was it possible she'd been caught in a drug deal gone wrong? For now, detectives could only speculate. They had no weapon, no eyewitnesses, and only fragments of a story that didn't quite fit together. Then, a potential break came. A man and his teenage son contacted police to report seeing a green SUV matching Ingga's vehicle parked along Adams Street the night of the murder. They thought they had noticed 2 people inside, possibly a man and a woman. It was dark, and the vehicle's windows were heavily tinted, so they couldn't see clearly, but they thought they might have heard voices, maybe even an argument. While their description was vague, it gave investigators something tangible to work with. The detail of 2 people inside the SUV suggested Ingga hadn't been alone in those final moments, and that whoever sat beside her that night might hold the key to understanding how a simple late-night errand turned into a brutal killing. The witnesses who saw Ingga's SUV on Adams Street were unable to identify anyone inside the vehicle. They couldn't describe who was in the driver's seat, and their vague account led investigators to yet another frustrating dead end. With no clear leads, detectives shifted their focus from eyewitness testimony to recent arrests in the area, hoping that someone in custody might have information about the murder. Then, a potential suspect unexpectedly surfaced. Not long after Ingga's death, a young man had been arrested in northeast D.C. for illegal possession of a .380 handgun, the same caliber weapon used in her killing. This immediately caught the attention of detectives. "We were trying to figure out who could have done this," one investigator explained. "When we heard about a kid being picked up with a .380, we had to check it out." During questioning, the young suspect hinted that he might know something about the murder. It wasn't uncommon for police to ask those arrested in drug or weapons cases if they had information about recent violent crimes in the same area. Sometimes, individuals shared tips hoping to earn leniency on their own charges. At first, the suspect's claims stunned investigators. Was he admitting involvement? Had he witnessed something? Or was he simply repeating rumors he'd heard on the street? There was also the possibility that he was trying to deflect blame by pointing to someone else. To find out, the police sent the confiscated handgun to the Metropolitan Police Department's firearms unit for ballistic testing. Technicians compared it against the shell casings recovered from Ingga Wilson's SUV. If it matched, the case could take a major turn. But the results came back negative. It was not the murder weapon. The young man had been bluffing, hoping his information would buy him a lighter sentence. Once again, investigators were back at square one. With the trail growing cold, the FBI and local detectives decided to take a different approach. They began to look more closely at Ingga's personal life, her habits, relationships, and anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. "You want to know everything," said Agent Brad Garrett. "Their relationship, their finances, jealousy, other people possibly involved. You have to examine every corner of their lives." It was time to dig deeper into the Wilson family itself, and what investigators found next would begin to shift the entire direction of the case. In the early 1992, Ingga met Brian Wilson, and the two quickly formed a connection. Friends remembered Brian as a tall, quiet, and deeply spiritual man, someone who would pray for others and always lend a helping hand. Together, they appeared to be a picture-perfect couple, attractive, devoted, and seemingly inseparable. They married in 1992, and 2 years later welcomed their first son. A second child followed several years afterward, completing what looked like a happy, stable family. Brian worked as a U.S. postal worker, while Ingga built a successful career as a bank manager. Both were deeply involved in their church. Brian served as a deacon, and Ingga was an active missionary. They were known for their faith, community involvement, and the strong example they set for others. However, behind the outward image of harmony, cracks had begun to show. According to family members, not everyone in Ingga's circle wished her well. "Her girlfriends acted like they were for her," one relative recalled. "But I didn't think all of them really were. There was jealousy." Ingga seemed to have it all: a good marriage, a beautiful home, a nice car, and a respected career. To some, that success attracted envy. One source of conflict stood out above all others: Brian's ex-girlfriend, the mother of his 2 older children. She and Ingga had a long and bitter history. "She didn't like Ingga," one family member admitted. "We all knew that. She would just show up unannounced, make a scene in the neighborhood. It made things really hard for Ingga." The tension between the 2 women sometimes escalated to the point of legal action, with restraining orders filed by one or the other. When Brian was ultimately awarded custody of his children from that relationship, the situation became even more volatile. The boys lived with Brian and Ingga, a situation that infuriated his ex. "She couldn't stand the thought of another woman raising her kids," one investigator later explained. That was a constant source of conflict. Ingga herself confided in family that she felt the biological mother was trying to turn the children against her, planting resentment and causing turmoil at home. What had started as a family dispute was now beginning to look like something much darker, and detectives wondered whether this long-standing feud might somehow be connected to Ingga's tragic death. Tensions between Ingga and Brian's ex-girlfriend eventually reached a breaking point. The hostility became so intense that Ingga confided to friends and relatives that she was genuinely afraid of her husband's former partner. "Someone coming into your home, yelling, causing a scene, it's embarrassing," one family member recalled Ingga saying. "But more than that, it's frightening. You don't know what they might do to you or to your family." Given the history of animosity, the ex-girlfriend became the first major suspect after Ingga's murder. She had motive, jealousy, anger, and an ongoing custody battle with Brian over their children. To investigators, it seemed plausible that her resentment could have escalated to violence. Ingga thought she might actually do something to her, a relative explained. "We all thought she could have done it." But when the FBI and D.C. Metropolitan Police began piecing together the case, a different picture emerged. After days of interviews and forensic analysis, the ex-girlfriend's alibi checked out. Investigators confirmed her whereabouts during the night of Ingga's murder. She was nowhere near the Wilson home. "We were able to verify exactly where she was at the time," one agent later said. "We ruled her out completely." With Ingga's most obvious enemy cleared, attention turned to the person closest to her husband, Brian Wilson. "In every homicide investigation, you start with the people closest to the victim," explained FBI agent Garrett. "You either eliminate them quickly or you don't. In this case, we couldn't eliminate him, and in fact, the evidence began to point the other way. While Brian didn't own a weapon and appeared to have no access to one at the time of the murder, investigators soon uncovered something else, a secret that shattered his image as a devoted husband and man of faith. The church-going postal worker, known to friends as a quiet, prayerful family man, was living a double life. "We found out he was having an affair," Agent Garrett said. "A relationship with a woman at the post office." Detectives went straight to the postal branch where Brian worked, interviewing nearly every employee. Before long, they identified the woman at the center of the secret, a fellow letter carrier named Renee Benjamin. When investigators brought Renee in for questioning, she began to share a story that would change everything they thought they knew about Brian Wilson and about what might have really happened to Ingga. Renee Benjamin, a single mother, had only been working at the post office for a few months when she first met Brian Wilson. Their initial encounters were brief, simple greetings in passing, but soon Brian took the initiative to introduce himself. Renee remembered him as warm and approachable, a man with a bright smile and an easy charm that made people comfortable. He seemed to get along with everyone, and before long, he began helping her with her mail routes. Their friendship grew naturally, leading to casual walks in the park that slowly turned into something deeper. Renee described Brian as a man who always knew what to say. He was attentive, thoughtful, and made her feel genuinely cared for. To her, he seemed like the kind of person who was kind-hearted and sincere. What she didn't know, however, was that Brian was living a double life. Behind his soft-spoken demeanor, he was hiding a crucial truth: his marriage to Ingga Wilson. Ingga had complete faith in her husband, never suspecting he was being unfaithful. Renee, on the other hand, was kept entirely in the dark. She told investigators that she never saw a wedding ring and that Brian had never mentioned a wife. "It was easy for him to hide it," she admitted. It wasn't until a coworker quietly revealed the truth that Renee discovered Brian was married. Shocked and hurt, she confronted him and ended their relationship immediately. But Brian didn't take the rejection well. According to Renee, he began showing up unexpectedly on her mail route, outside her house in the early morning, anywhere he could catch her attention. She eventually agreed to remain friends just to ease the tension, but she made it clear their romantic relationship was over. Over time, their conversations resumed, and Brian began opening up about his marriage. He told Renee that he was unhappy at home, often portraying himself as a man trapped in a difficult situation. Then, just a week before Ingga's murder, Brian called Renee with shocking news. He claimed his wife and 2 of their children had been in a terrible car accident. His voice, she recalled, was filled with despair as he told her that his wife was in a coma and might not survive. Unbeknownst to Renee, this phone call would soon take on a chilling new meaning once the truth behind Ingga Wilson's death came to light. Brian told Renee that his wife and their 2 youngest children had been in a terrible car accident. His voice was strained with worry as he explained that the boys were fine, but his wife was in critical condition. He said Ingga had suffered severe injuries and was now in a coma. Doctors, he claimed, weren't sure if she would survive. As the days passed, Brian's story grew darker and more dramatic. He told Renee that the situation had worsened and that he was on his way to Washington, D.C. because doctors were preparing to take his wife off life support. "They're going to pull the plug tonight," he supposedly told her, his tone heavy with grief. Renee recalled that the next time she heard from Brian was on the night of December 12th, the very night Ingga was murdered. She was at a party when her phone rang. Brian sounded distraught, saying that his wife had just died at the hospital. He told her he was walking around D.C., trying to clear his mind, and asked if she could come pick him up. I really need you, he pleaded, but Renee refused. I told him I couldn't, she said. I told him to just call me later and let me know how he was doing. That was the last conversation they had that night. It wasn't until Monday, when Renee returned to work, that she discovered the horrifying truth. A coworker quietly pulled her aside and said she had heard that Ingga hadn't died in a hospital at all. She had been murdered. Shocked and disbelieving, Renee immediately called her mother and asked her to check the newspaper. Can you see if there's an article about an Ingga Wilson who was killed? She asked. Her mother searched and soon found the report. As she read the article aloud, Renee felt numb. The details didn't match the story Brian had told her. Ingga hadn't died in a hospital bed. She had been found shot to death in her SUV. I couldn't believe it, Renee said later. It didn't feel real. It was like something out of a nightmare. But as investigators would soon uncover, Renee wasn't the only one left stunned by the truth about Brian Wilson and the dark secret he had been hiding. Renee's story sounded believable, but if what she claimed was true, it meant that Brian Wilson had been spinning an elaborate web of lies. Outwardly, he appeared to have the perfect marriage, a loving wife, 2 children, and a solid career. Yet, behind the image of stability, there was deceit, manipulation, and perhaps something far darker. Investigators knew they had to tread carefully. If Renee was being honest, she could hold the key to understanding Brian's motives and movements the night his wife was killed. But if she wasn't, then she might be hiding a role of her own in Ingga Wilson's murder. 2 months after Ingga's death, the FBI and D.C. Metropolitan Police uncovered proof that Brian had lied to Renee about what happened to his wife. Instead of telling her the truth that Ingga had been shot, he had fabricated a story about a fatal car accident. This revelation raised new questions about Renee's involvement. Was she an innocent bystander caught in his deception, or did she know more than she was admitting? Renee came forward willingly, claiming she wanted to help investigators. I told them everything I knew, she said. Detectives still had to verify every detail of her account. They interviewed postal workers who knew both Brian and Renee, trying to piece together their relationship and determine whether she might have helped him in some way. At that point, we had to consider every possibility, one investigator later explained. Did she pick him up that night? Was she aware of what really happened? Or could she have even been part of the plan? Renee faced multiple rounds of questioning over the next several months. Detectives pressed her for specifics about her conversations with Brian on the night of December 12th. She recalled that he called her sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning. His voice was desperate as he asked for a ride home from D.C. I really need you, she remembered him saying. But Renee refused. I told him I couldn't come pick him up, she said quietly. I just told him to call me later. For investigators, the details she provided were critical. If her timeline could be confirmed, it might prove she wasn't involved. But if her story faltered under scrutiny, it could mean that the woman who claimed to be an innocent ex-lover knew far more about the murder of Ingga Wilson than she let on. Brian insisted he had never gone to D.C. the night Ingga was killed. He said he remained in Upper Marlboro, driving around and searching for his wife, and denied any contact with his former lover, Renee Benjamin. Repeated questions about his whereabouts were met with the same response. He was not in the city. Investigators checked phone records to verify those claims. The log showed only one use of Brian's phone during the period when he said he was roaming the streets, an outgoing call at 12:51 a.m. That lasted about 51 or 52 seconds, made to check his voicemail. There was no record of any call to Renee. Detectives reviewed the records closely but found no evidence to confirm the conversation Renee described. When agents confronted Brian with inconsistencies, he shut down. Answers that had once come easily fell away. On tougher questions, he simply stopped talking. With each silence, the case grew more puzzling. More than a year after Ingga's murder, authorities suspected Brian knew more than he admitted, but they still lacked anything concrete tying him to the crime. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and no proof he had access to a gun. At times, the investigation ran into dead ends and stalled. Then, unexpectedly, a tip arrived. Someone called from a party saying they had overheard an argument in a back room, Brian demanding a gun be returned to him. The snippet of overheard words suggested desperation. "I need the gun now." That fragment offered the investigative team a fresh lead at a moment when they had few options left. Detectives began to question whether Brian had ever possessed a gun, and when they investigated further, the truth started to unfold. The man Brian had been overheard arguing with at the party turned out to be a close friend. When questioned, the friend eventually admitted that he had once given Brian Wilson a .380 handgun, the same type of weapon linked to the shell casings found near Ingga's body. He told police that he suspected Brian might have used his weapon to commit the murder. Investigators believed this witness could connect Brian to the murder weapon, but his statement alone wasn't enough. To gather solid evidence, they convinced the friend to wear a wire and speak with Brian about the weapon. From a nearby surveillance van, Special Agent Garrett and his team watched as Brian entered the informant's car. The hidden camera recorded Brian asking his friend what he had done with the weapon. The friend replied that he had thrown it away in the river, insisting that it was gone. The exchange became tense, and the friend, growing angry, reportedly struck Brian in the face. On the recording, Brian denied killing his wife and claimed that he would never do something like that. However, the conversation gave investigators their first concrete proof that Brian Wilson had possessed a firearm close to the time of the murder. They knew that if they could recover the weapon, their case would be nearly airtight. Without it, however, there remained the troubling question of whether there was enough evidence to charge Brian Wilson, or if he might walk free. The FBI and Washington, D.C. police had grown increasingly convinced that Brian Wilson was responsible for the murder of his wife. Each new discovery seemed to bring him closer to being identified as the killer. Investigators immediately turned their attention to Maryland's Patuxent River near Upper Marlboro, where Brian had claimed to have thrown away the weapon. However, as one officer noted, searching a river for a weapon was nearly impossible. They even checked a nearby pond behind a house connected to the case, but the weapon was nowhere to be found. Without the weapon, detectives knew they needed to place Brian near the scene of the murder to strengthen their case. They once again examined whether Brian had called Renee Benjamin the night Ingga was killed. Up to that point, everything Renee had told investigators had been verified except for the missing record of that call. It was one of the biggest mysteries of the case. Why was there no trace of the phone conversation she described? Then, the investigation took a major turn. Cell phone data revealed that Brian's phone had connected to a tower located near the scene of the crime. This discovery contradicted his repeated claims that he had not been in Washington, D.C. that night. His phone had essentially placed him at the location where his wife was murdered. Investigators decided to question Renee again, hoping to solve the missing phone record puzzle. During the interview, they finally learned the reason why no standard call record existed. Renee explained that Brian had used a two-way Nextel Direct Connect feature, the walkie-talkie style communication popular at the time, which did not appear in normal phone logs. The realization was a breakthrough moment for the team. Although the phone company no longer had Brian's two-way records, they did retain Renee's. When investigators reviewed her data, they found two direct connect communications between her phone and Brian's at approximately 12:56 a.m. on Saturday, December 13th. The evidence confirmed that Brian had indeed contacted Renee that night just as she had claimed, and that he was within close proximity to Ingga's car when the murder occurred. This revelation became the final piece of the puzzle investigators needed. It not only supported Renee's testimony but also firmly placed Brian Wilson at the crime scene, tightening the noose around him as the prime suspect in his wife's death. In September 2005, nearly 2 years after Ingga's brutal murder, authorities finally arrested Brian Wilson, charging him with first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through Ingga's family, who had never once suspected him. To them, Brian had always appeared to be a loving husband and devoted father. One family member described the moment as devastating, saying they never imagined he could be capable of such cruelty. Detectives, however, reminded them that the perpetrator is often someone much closer than anyone realizes, sometimes the very person you look in the eye every day. By May 2007, Brian Wilson stood trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, since no eyewitnesses or murder weapon had ever been recovered. As one investigator explained, there was no single big brick that proved his guilt outright. Instead, the case was built one small piece of evidence at a time, forming a solid wall of proof. The strongest part of that foundation was the testimony of Brian's former lover, Renee Benjamin. During the trial, prosecutors meticulously presented their evidence from cell phone records, placing Brian near the scene of the crime, to the secretly recorded video where he admitted having access to a weapon at the time of the murder. But the most powerful moment in court came when Renee took the stand. She recalled the emotional toll of testifying, explaining that she tried not to look directly at Brian during her testimony. "I kind of glanced over at him," she said, "but we didn't make eye contact. He was just staring off somewhere else." Reliving her relationship with him, she admitted, was exhausting and painful, a haunting reminder of how easily she had been deceived. Prosecutors then pieced together what they believed happened on the night of the murder. They theorized that Brian and Ingga had gone out to dinner and a movie, appearing to be an ordinary couple enjoying a night together. But on the drive home, something changed, an argument, perhaps fueled by years of tension, jealousy, and betrayal, that would end in tragedy. Prosecutors believe that at some point during the night, Brian convinced Ingga to drive with him into Washington, D.C. He parked the car on the 3000 block of Adams Street, a quiet area not far from the bustling nightlife of Northeast D. There, they said, he shot and killed her. Afterward, he allegedly called Renee Benjamin, asking her to pick him up, but she refused. Eventually, someone else drove him back to Upper Marlboro, Maryland. Once home, Brian began calling relatives, pretending to be frantic and worried. He told them that he had been searching for his wife everywhere and asked if anyone had heard from her. Throughout the trial, Brian Wilson chose not to testify in his own defense. Prosecutors admitted they could not determine with absolute certainty why he had killed his wife, but they believed jealousy and selfish desire played a major role. In their view, Ingga had become an obstacle, someone standing in the way of the life Brian wanted to build with his former lover, Renee Benjamin. To him, she was no longer useful, and the cold decision to eliminate her reflected that twisted mindset. Investigators also addressed the discovery of drug paraphernalia at the crime scene, confirming that none of it could be traced to Ingga. There was no evidence she had ever used drugs, and those items were unrelated to the events that led to her death. After a week of deliberations, the jury found Brian Wilson guilty of first-degree murder. He was later sentenced to 66 years in federal prison. For Ingga's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but not peace. To die the way she did was unforgivable, one relative said, expressing disbelief that a man who once seemed so loving could commit such a brutal act. Even Renee struggled to comprehend it. "Thinking back to that night," she said, "I never would have known just from his voice that he had done something like that. It's mind-boggling."